Hello everyone, I'm Drifting, and today I have a very unique web novel to talk about. Before we get into it, the title of the specific web novel is called 27 Years. It's a very simple title, but it's very unique for the reasons I will get into in a little bit. So let's start off with some of the introductions and tags before I get into kind of the summary and genre analysis, because this is going to be a heavy one. This is going to be very challenging for me. So let's start at the beginning. 27 years. The author is um, Ronke. I don't really know how to pronounce it because it's all in English letters. It has 532 chapters. It was initially written, I think, if I'm not mistaken, May 5th, 2021, and it was finished in July 31st, 2023. So it took the author about one and almost 2 years, like 1 year and like 9 months, um, totaling 531 chapters and a total of 2 million words, which would translate to somewhere closer to 2.4 million words, because one Chinese character roughly averages out to about 1.3 English words. So it's very long. The author did a very good job of updating the story. Um, there's a couple ways to read a story, whereas you read it update by update, or you just binge read the whole thing. I might get into that a little bit later. Um, as we get into what type of story this is, but I will say this is harder to read as an update to update because there are so many long arcs and volumes. And I think my exact comment on this was some people forget the web novel part of web novel, and they just literally write novels and novels. And I'll get into why this was so unique and even so challenging to read this particular web novel, but why in the end it also feels so fulfilling as well. So let's get into the summary. That's enough about the background. Here's the brief description that the author wrote. The world is in a turbulent era of transition between old and new societies. The collision of politics, economy, thought, and culture is becoming increasingly fierce. Most Varak, a photographer from the slums of Sovold, was reborn 2 months ago. He started to pretend to be the son of a consortium again. In the rapid in the turmoil of rapid industrial development and crazy expansion of ambitions, he stirred up everything and subverted the world. And then obviously some censorship tags just to clarify. This is an imaginary world. Please do not bring contemporary history into this. The album of the same name, 27 Years, has also been released on major music platforms. Some of the tags are this is alternative history, so alt history, so a little bit of warning, historical fantasy. It is a light novel, it is a web novel, it's supposed to be passionate, it's not supposed to be taken too seriously, but also to tell an interesting story, but not to draw too much upon it. The reason why some of these censorship tags exist actually has to do with the way the culture is around web novels, especially these particular web novels, which is certain historical fantasy web novels like to take history out of context because history is kind of boring to read from textbooks and to learn. So for a sense of responsibility, names and characters have to be changed or the historical outcome has to be correct. Like otherwise, if someone reads a web novel and that historical character does the wrong thing, you have to either make it explicitly clear that this is not real history, or you have to make sure history follows a general overarching path and then you add clarifications. Because we can't, like, you could go to an alt history of if Hitler won World War II, but you better clarify that Hitler did not win World War II. Because if web novels are like kind of teaching the wrong, there's like a limit to fantasy, and so this goes into the moral dilemma of freedom of speech and writing and then censorship. But there's also like that era of making sure you're not teaching the wrong thing or the wrong ideology. Okay, I don't want to get into this conversation because this is too broad and it is not for me to critique upon. I'm just clarifying some of those things and why the reasons for why the rationale for why they might include that. Anyway, I don't want to get into it because that's not the web novel or the story we're here to talk about. But one of the descriptors of 27 years is awakening to hold the power of the world, lying drunk on the knees of beautiful women, 5,000 years of glory. So already you can tell, very loaded language, and it is going to be. I wouldn't say this is one of those passionate, hot-blooded web novels. The rough translation would be Russia. But the title of this web novel is 27 Years, or in the Chinese title is 二十七 载, if I'm not mistaken, right? Um, Let me just double check. Yeah, 二十七载. Um, which just translates to 27 years. Very simple title, but very profound, very complex, very nuanced, very, very complicated for reasons which I will get into before we get into genre. I know I'm doing this a little bit different and out of order, but this is going to take a little bit of explaining, a lot of defending, because this is a very unique, compact web novel with a lot of nuances that just make it very challenging and unique to read. So let's get into this, shall we? Our main character goes by the name Most Varrock. Um, he is not from the modern world, so we are not talking about an isekai reincarnation or transported to another world, transmigration, I believe. I like to pronounce that as transmigration. So genre analysis and titles that would be very similar would be Joys of Life, Grandmaster Strategist. A very popular title would be Everlasting Immortal Firmament. The prequel to that would be it's a continuation of the Chronicles of Guhai, Otherworldly Evil Monarch, various styles like that. Zetianji, which is Way of Choices. The two big ones that also come to mind are a lot of these industrial web novel like Magical Industry Empire. I read the raws of that before that even came out. Same with Power and Wealth, Extraordinary Genius. Extraordinary Genius is really, really early in the um, urban life genre as well, along with a lot of other stuff like Valiant Life, Almighty Coach, The Monk Who Wanted Renounced Asceticism, and all that. So a lot of those old antique classic web novels, but also Sword of Daybreak, and World of Deities, which hopefully, if I have time, I'll get into in Counterfeit Hero. But this is very much one of those industrial, go with the times web novel. Our web novel is set in 1433. We start in July in the slums of Solvald, which is in the country or empire of Bresci. Bresci suppose supposed to be a fictional parallel of France. There are I'm not going to go too much into the world building because you can definitely read that for yourself and I'll explain it, but I kind of just want to take you through the story, through the arcs, through the volumes, and just do some very interesting character comparisons and unique attributes of this web novel. This is an amazing web novel. I very rarely ever pull out some junk. I don't want to say junk because that's an insult. Um, because all web novels are really a work of art by the author, right? I shouldn't say too much because I'm not too serious of a critic. I very much subscribe to Anton Ego's speech in Ratatouille, which is, a critic's job is to be in defense of the new and to praise rather than to criticize, right? To discover, right? And that is why we are here today to read amazing web novels. And 27 years is very unique, both in terms of quality, in terms of density, in terms of sophistication, and the challenge in which it is written, right? Um, I would say not to put down Lord of Mysteries. I compare it because I love them and I know those are like the touchstones of web novels. But compared to Klein Moretti, I do believe that our you compare them because they're great, right? Samsung compares themselves to Apple because they're great. Most Varrock, I think, is a better Klein Moretti. And I know I'm saying a lot, but that's also because I'm comparing spoilers for Lord of Mysteries, or even Beginning of the End's actually pretty good, but I always obviously Lord of Mysteries is as big as it is, just like My Vampire System. Not comparing the two, I'm just saying they're big and they're popular for a reason. But if you know the story of Klein Moretti and Lord of Mysteries, I inevitably think of Project K or See Possibility of Money and Control. And to be honest with me, I loved Project K. I can respect Lord of Mysteries. Like I may not have fully read it, just like I may not have fully read One Piece or watched JoJo, the anime series. But I will acknowledge they hold a place in cultural history, and so I don't look down upon them. It's more that it's just not for me. And 27 years, may not be for someone else, but that's why I'm here to talk about some of these amazing web novels and what they're so similar to, right? I like to compare Rewrite a lot, but I've brought that up so many times that I think it's best to move on to other titles as well, right? 27 years is something I've pulled out of my Dragon's Hoard. Just to go on a little bit of a quick tangent. Um, Back in the day when I was considering translation before I realized how when I did not know how to out of my depth I was wanting to create like some sort of Discord server or something, or a translation group, and I was going to name it something like I wanted to name it something akin to like the Green Day's song, Boulevard of Broken Dreams, the Hidden Alleyway, right? Just like a generic anime bookstore type of vibe that you kind of discover off the beaten trail, and just a quiet place, right? I'm thinking of Hemingway's uh, bright well lit place in Cuba. There's so many references, um, and within that, right, that group that I never created for that WordPress site, I never created for a Discord server, I never created. I'm being 100% honest here, and I'm being 100% sincere and genuine. Never created any of that. This is all like because I was always so wrapped up on names, I eventually stumbled like just crafting names, right? Jewelry store, whatnot, because I wanted to get to this theme of hidden gems, right? Like, diamond in the rough, right? And all those, treasure metaphors, right? Antique web novels, gold, silver, right? Old and new friends. And the Dragon's Hoard, right? The Dragon's Hoard of all web novels, right? Where each site is a cache, right? Each site is a hidden cache or hidden treasure of web novels. And web novel readers are these dragons that hoard, these web novel stories to themselves, right? And instead of evil dragons to be slain, they're more like treasures to be distributed and shared and to be appreciated and admired, right? Like a jewelry store or a museum. And so each of these hidden gems are just stories that haven't been brought to light. Not Diamonds in the Rough would be something like a web novel that's being written or an author that's developing a style, but a hidden gem is something that maybe no one's ever seen that needs to be just polished a little. Whereas the touchstones, the ones that have been acknowledged, like Lord of Mysteries, The Legendary Mechanic, Overgeared, those are like diamonds polished by time and appreciated by many, right? Like great works of art. And so I really wanted to name that translation group, the Hidden Alleyway, or like the Boulevard or Avenue of web novels or something of the sort. Something like Sixth Avenue, and I'll get into that. But yeah, I just like the idea of comparing web novel readers to treasure dragons because, you have anime, you have manga, you have light novels and visual novels, and then you just have web novels there in the background. Um, Complaining that we don't get manga, just like manga readers complaining they don't get anime. But anyway, back to 27 years and what made this so special, so complicated, and so challenging. I need to tell you the story of Most Varak and just the density of the story. I'm going to talk around it before I really get into spoilers. The story really takes its time to develop. There are constant mysteries and twists and turns that you do not expect. I read this back in 2021 as an update series, right? And this is not one of those series to be updated, right? Like Nomenclature of the Night, you could kind of get away with it because the author's familiar with, cliffhangers, Spare Me Great Lord. I would compare this to The Outcast and like Nomenclature of the Night. Those are great web novels that I think will become touchstones in and of its own time. They will come into themselves. Same with Spare Me Great Lord. It just needs to get translated properly and once it gets the joy it deserves, it definitely will grow. Tomorrow Hasn't Arrived. I did that obviously because I don't think anyone would ever pick that up. The Outcast. That's a great web novel, but I think that's also been buried by time and Star Ranked Hunter. But I'm not here to take yearbook photos. I'm here, not even here to make history. I'm just here to bring out some awesome stories, right? Counterfeit Hero is awesome, but I don't know if I'll have the time to get into that because I need to fully read it, and these 500 chapters took me a total of 24 hours to read. So, that's a good week's worth of time, of free time that you need to read through like 2.4 million words. Um, Crime and Punishment in comparison is only 211,000 words. The US tax code is 4 million words, so that's half of the US tax code. The King James version of the Bible is 788,000 words approximately. So that's like two King James Bibles and two Crime and Punishments worth, or 10 Crime and Punishments worth of books, right? Or two Harry Potter series, because one Harry Potter series is 1 million. And there are some crazy series out there, right? The longest fan fiction is 44 million words, or about twice as long as the US law code. So you could be a lawyer if you read. But yeah, even MGA readers, that's 10 million words. That's half of the 22 million in like the approximate US law code, or 4 million for the US tax code. And I've met a couple of crazy readers, like living for a QQ farm in another world. That's 10,000 chapters, 2,000 words a chapter. So that's for 20 million words by that count. So kind of crazy, the readers there. I've met a couple readers who actually dared to read that, and I genuinely think those authors are insane. I've I've never gone up over 5K. I've never even gone over 3K. I'm getting there. I'm actually very close to a fan fiction that's going to go over 3K, but never like an actual Wuxia story. But 27, I guess it's time to summarize the story, isn't it? 27 begins with 27 has a lot of volumes. There's a marketable shift from volume 4 to volume 6, which I will get into some of the controversies in a little bit and some of my thoughts in depth into that, and that's what makes this so challenging and complex to cover. But let's start with the first 4 volumes before we get there. We start with a character in the slums, Most Farak, who has gone back in time, right? Most Farak is very different from your average protagonist because he is not born from wealth. He is very much a commoner. He is someone with no knowledge of the world, so he is very much like us as a reader, very lost and slowly discovering the things. The only difference he has a second chance. We see this in Noble Mage Behind the Scenes. I recently read a couple series, right? Real Life Player with Yunha, which name means Galaxy. Go Sick, which was all about candy bullets, which actually make I might even get into that. Giving a heart of steel to a weak girl. Oh yeah, oh yeah, I remember this because there's a Chinese character that was interesting. Instead of 给予弱女钢铁之心, so to give a weak woman a heart of steel. It's a very beautiful web novel in its own right. It's very similar to Full Time Artist. Um, but yeah, 27, we start off with a character in the slums. So instead of like, a Chable or a noble, something like living as the enemy prince, or the villain wants to live, where a character has an established identity, this is very much where a character is thrust into this identity. We see that with the undercover professor in the academy. I think that's a webtoon. The villain wants to live, right, where you're in a where you have foreknowledge, where you're in a Tome game and you're suddenly reincarnated as the villain, such as Beware the Villainess or I Am the Villainess, right? Our main character has no knowledge of that. He has gone back into the past, very much like magical industrial empire. So there's a brand new world to him. He's in the slums, so he is not a foreigner of the world. He's not like Reverend Insanity, where he is an outsider. He is a native of that world, of that wuxia. So we aren't going to get into xianxia semantics. This is very much an industrialization of the Times web novel, and we will see our character develop through the story. And because of that, this is a novel. This is a web novel. I emphasize the novel part of web novel. He completely ignored the web part of web novel, and he just wrote novel after novel after novel. Each volume is a novel in and of itself, and it's just a great web series. I don't recommend you reading it update by update, chapter by chapter, because you're gonna want to binge it because this is not a cliffhanger one. This is like you have to read this like an actual novel. The reason why I mentioned this is because the writing style is so dense that it cannot really be picked up and put down. There's no good place to put it down except at the end of the arc. Just like you would binge watch One Piece, you can stop and rest, but it's really hard to get back into it just because of the sheer density that you would as if you would read a real novel, right? Like web novels are web novels for a reason. They have the word novels in them because they can be as very casual as picking it up and putting them down and reading it weekly update by update. I assure you, this is not one of them. And I think you'll be happy because you don't have to keep returning to it and check for updates. This is all complete. It's 500 chapters. I mean, it's a good maybe month's worth of reading, but it is by far a really fun read. So let's get into the story. I'll summarize things and, spoiler warning, like I will get into some of it, but I won't reveal all the secrets, and that is up for you to read. There's so many fun characters though. We start off with our main character, Most Farak, right? He is sent back into the past, but he has a special identity. He is a doppelganger of a noble named Thomas Cleese. Thomas Chris actually, but translation issues, Thomas Cleese, Thomas Chris. He is taken back to the past and he has 2 months premonition of the future. That's it. He only has 2 months of worth of the future, but he knows what's about to happen. He is about to be taken from the slums to a noble family, and we're not quite sure why in the early chapters. But he knows we as readers have less information than our main character, the protagonist, Most Varak, right? Names will be very important. He only uses surnames. He has two friends in the slums, right? Nord and Dempsey. These are his life and death friends. They've been working for a long time, for a decade, right? Most Varak is a photographer. Dempsey is a hardworking factory man. And Nord, same thing. They're living in the slums. They're very uneducated. Um, They are outsiders, and we get into this idea of equality and like the various levels of classes and social inequality and upward mobility. Whereas they are expected to die young, there's nothing really to live for, even in this prosperous world, right? This prosperous age, in this very prosperous empire. They are just very much peasants living day by day. Nord and Dempsey are factory workers, but the most important thing is they are Nord's they will act as most Vrak's guiding post of where he starts to where he grows to. Nord is very much someone who desires wealth. He wants to live in comfort. He goes on this rant about, oh, I wish to be rich. Whereas um, Dempsey, I think, is a little bit more realistic. He's not as lazy. He's very much more social. He's very fast on his feet, but he's loyal. And so most Vrak, knowing the future, decides to bring these two friends along into this complex web of aristocracy, right? He is a doppelganger. He's a replacement for Thomas Chris, a family, the Thomas family, one of the aristocrats, the noble families of the government, of the French or the Bressy Empire, right? Bressy being a parallel for France. Um, and he is thrust into this new world of having to learn manners and talents from this slum underdog to this world of luxury, and we are suddenly thrust into this world of 27 of the Bressy Empire. And we know that most Vrak has intelligence because he has 2 months of knowledge, right? He is around 23 at this age, right? We are in 1433 in around July, so we are in the beginning of the industrialization era. Feudalism is slowly starting to die. We are seeing the rise of constitutional monarchy, and we are slowly transitioning into industrialization. There are glimpses of it, but industrialization is much, much later on to volume 4, and it doesn't even cover that. This is not like magical industrial empire where you have someone bringing technology. No, all of this must be discovered because they are natives, and this is just historical art alternative fantasy where anything can happen, but this is its own self subworld, right? Very much like Xianxia, where it's like, people must develop. This is its own unique cultural universe. Oh, I missed talking about Ultraman and Sixth Avenue, but maybe I'll add some of that later. So most Vrak, having this new identity as the doppelganger of Thomas Cleese, has to reintegrate into the Thomas Cleese family. And there are so many intricacies, so many conspiracies, so many twists and turns of betrayals, right? People die. Okay. So for one of the first minor spoilers for Volume One, um he and his friends are separated, and he must make some choices of whether to he has to make several choices and navigate not only the future that he does not know and the relationships he has to rebuild, but the possibilities that never existed, right? This is called this butterfly effect, which is, why is it that the time traveler changes, the chaos effect, right, impact him the most? And it's because the closer you are to changing, the closer you are to the butterfly, the closer you are to the wings of the butterfly, right, the greater the changes are because you. Ah, yes, Lorentz attractors, of course, dynamical systems and attractors, of course. Gonki has a great video on that. Um, but most Vrak is thrust into this high class society having to navigate this new world, right? But first, he needs to regain his identity. He has no name to himself. He is just a doppelganger. He is a replacement, and he has no social status, not in his family, not in the world. Most Vrak is dead, and the only person that exists is Thomas Cleese. But Thomas Cleese has secrets of his own. Thomas Cleese has died under mysterious circumstances. We don't know why. So the first mystery that most Vrak has to uncover is, who was Thomas Cleese? Very much as we see in Lord of Mysteries, right? I'm trying to discover what is this universe, what is this thing. Um, our mystery that most Vrak, the first problem he has to solve in Volume 1 is, who is he, who was Thomas Chris, and what did he do? And as you slowly go through the story, he starts to uncover Thomas Cleese was doing something big. He was doing something profound. He wrote a new branch, a new school of thought. He was a rebel. He was a resistance fighter. He was, in essence, a domestic terrorist. Politics and domestic terrorism very, very closely interlinked, just as you would say political theory and religion. And now we get into one of the first things that I won't read too much into, which is the political ideologies and thought in this web novel. It goes quite deep into philosophy and political philosophy and history. And one of the first things it tries to introduce is equality. And it places it in a very unique time period, which is Bressy, France, right? Um, for those of you who don't know, but I think most of you might know of the history of France, there was a French Revolution. It's gone through many republics, from Napoleon to Germany, and the rise and fall of countries in Europe, right? You had Russia, you had China, no, Russia, you had England, you had Italy, you had Spain, you had the United States, and it was just this vibrant period from the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and then revolution, right? I've always wanted to talk about revolution, and the successful factors in revolution. Um, um, Strategy stuff does some great videos on what are the causes of revolution. In modern revolution with weaponry, the fight for revolution and equality. And it tries to introduce this idea of equality through the various principles of the original thinkers, right? Of philosophers such as Voltaire and Pierre Leroux on, the social contract, John Smith's is a very different one. No, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations that advocates for a more democratic capitalist movement, free trade, actually, as I would like to say, which is a liberalization of mercantilism into the new theories of economics, of capital, of demand, of industrialization, right? So new political theories are being formed alongside technology, social theory, right? The social contract. The term capitalism existed much long before Marx, Engels. I think I don't really know Marxist theory that well. Lenin, Trotsky, whatnot. I roughly know the high level stuff, but not many of the details or specifics. But capitalism, that's his term, right? Democracy is his term. I could get into the political discussion, right? If we want to do data driven political discussion, 9 out of 10 of the top countries, arguably speaking, would be democracies. The only exception being China, but we would consider that maybe a socialist democratic dictatorship or whatever. The worst 20 countries in terms of GDP, if you're using economic figures, would lean more toward autocracy or dictatorship, right? So the high end countries use democracy where they don't need it, but it's very useful in maintaining and allocating capital. The less developed countries, I forget what the proper or correct term for it is, because before it was third world countries, which is offensive. So then we used developed countries, and then on like there's just a lot of terms for it, so I don't want to get too much into political correctness, but I'm just going to use the term developing countries, um, that or industrializing countries. And a lot of those countries tend to use dictatorships or autocracy to maintain stability, which, democracy theoretically would lead them into higher mobility, better social movements, but you kind of need a good economy to maintain democracy. And if the economy backslides, so does democracy in and of itself. So that's kind of the issues that we're solving with democracy. Whereas capitalism is more on the economic side, that's much more political. There's some great arguments there, which is that, I love the translation, the mistranslation by, I want to say Leonid Brezhnev, because it's just a funner name for me to say, but it's actually Khrushchev, which is still a fun name to say, when he said, the famous mistranslated phrase, which we will bury you, and the correct term is we will dig you in, and that's more like to lend credence to the idea of the right side of history, and time will speak for itself, but then you get into issues of Victor's law, which is, victory is often determined or written by the victors. But hey, that's kind of the hyper competitive history nature of competition, right? Eventually, history will determine itself. It may not be the most correct, but at least we're all moving forward. And you can always borrow schools of thought, right? I've always wanted to address that issue with communism and some of the pitfalls of it, of even addressing communism, because that term is so loaded. I think a softer term or a more progressive term would be socialism, which is taking the ideals of equality of communism, but not necessarily the economic, political will, and then infusing that into democracy, right? Because we're still discovering what the future is, whether it's technocracy, hyper capitalism, right? Efficient capitalism, efficient market theory. Science, knowledge, and political theory has long been developed and has got a long more to go from the Enlightenment to now, right? There is no such thing as a set path in anything, right? From epistemology and philosophy to astrophysics, of general relativity and quantum field theory and science, right? A lot of paths of knowledge just have to be walked down and discovered to see what is right. In economics, I believe it's MMT, modern monetary theory, or post MMT, and all the other alternative and mainstream physics, non-mainstream physics, mathematics, right? What is it? And topology and chemistry. Um, a lot of these paths need to be discovered, whether it's quantum computing, lithography, nuclear fusion, right? There's so many different ways to do one thing properly, even CPU manufacturing, that these paths should have to be walked. And I think sometimes we forget that political philosophy was not built in a day. We went from mercantilism, right, in economics to free trade and so on and so forth, MMT, right, for economics, right. For political science, you had Niccolo Machiavelli theorizing about the dangers of power, emperors from constitutional monarchies to parliamentary democracies, right? To direct democracy from the Greeks to modern democracy that we would see in countries like the United States or Canada, right? And as I said before, lending credence to that data-driven thing, a lot of countries use democracy probably because it's successful for them, and time will tell if other methods will work, whether because U.S. democracy is a little less socialist compared to European democracies, but then again, the United States has different wealth inequality issues just due to the amount of wealth it possesses or controls. So certain things can be given and taken depending on those unique regional differences. But in the world of 27, we will see all those issues come to light in a little bit. And if you can't tell, a lot of these are mysteries to be unwrapped by most Verac and the journey that he goes upon, the hero journey. So I have now officially stepped out of Volume 1, and I will be throwing spoilers after spoilers. So I might decide to cut the video here, split it into two, or thing, but I am going to start to go into volumes. I'm going to uncover the full story, and if you're willing to stay, that's great. But if you want to hear, the full review of everything that goes on, this is kind of where it begins. But I'm still going to leave a lot of mysteries in here, so I highly encourage you to read it. So that's it for part one of this video, and I guess this is part two, the journey that most Farrak goes on. Okay, so a lot of characters die in Volume 1, which is very extreme, very jarring. And this is one of the reasons why I said this web novel was so challenging. I would dare I say even problematic, not even from the political aspect of it, which you won't even see until volumes like chapter 300 do we even get into any of those political controversy. The first 300 chapters are heavy modern French Revolution, the ideas of revolution, what causes revolution, where does inequality come from, upward mobility, right? Just this basic idea of survival, right? Not even like just like class conscious. We don't even talk about any of that stuff. That's thrown to an afterthought. Like chapter 400, do we even get into like class theory and whatnot? Like so, the communist propaganda, if you even want to call it that, is relatively low for the story it tells. At the beginning, you will see it in the lens of French independence, of French Revolution, right? Or Bressy Revolution, as the story would like to go, which is just ensuring the basic equality and surviving rights, right? The rights of common man, the rights of man. Um, it takes a more modern take on it, which means it spreads the idea of woman suffrage way earlier than it does in history, but it wants to emphasize this idea of equality. So the original tenets of liberty, justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, right? In French, it's liberty, equality, fraternity. Liberty meaning freedom, right? You cannot have anything without freedom. And then after freedom is achieved, you must have equality between people, or at least some semblance of fairness and order, right? That's what laws and justice are for. That I will not get into because that's too complicated. And like we have like a lot. Justice is and power is a complicated theory in and of itself, right? You have Foucault, Maoism of power comes from the barrel of a gun, right? Which goes into the idea of where power comes from, soft and hard power. As I said before, Foucault would probably be a very good jumping off point for that. Um, and fraternity, which means the idea of fraternity, they spin it in a very specific way, which means comrade. I don't like that specific term just because of the negative connotation or associations people have with comrade. I have my own personal remarks on it. I feel like the best way to describe comrade is same thing with fraternity, which is brotherhood, right? Brotherhood or just men at arms, right? It is the differentiating between us and you. We have used various terms and languages to delineate us and them. The most easiest way is social class or social status, right? Which have then evolved into this idea of citizenship and what it means to be a citizen, the rights bestowed upon a citizen going as far back as the Romans, right? You are a Roman citizen and we will do our best to protect you. This brings in this idea of nationality, of ethnicity, right? Like the countryside farmers are different from the urban metropolitan socialites, right? That goes much more into class theory, which I don't want to get into. I just want to go more into the idea of nationalism and ethnicity, right? The original term for barbarians means anyone who wasn't Roman, anyone who wasn't a Roman citizen. There were different classes or structures in the Roman social status, which was you have the rulers, the aristocrats, literally meaning, top of the pile, the king, the farmers, anyone who lived in the city, like politicians and whatnot, they were citizens of that city. They were citizens of the empire. And then you had the regular peasants of the empire. They weren't citizens. They didn't have this enjoy the same social class, but they were protected by the Roman government. And then you had the outsiders, right? The barbarians. Anyone who didn't speak Roman was a barbarian. That's where the original term barbarian comes from. The Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, they had various cultures. The French would have been barbarians. The Franks, right? So yeah, very interesting stuff. The Germanic tribes, really like they have their own culture, kind of like the Dark Ages, but it's that delineation between us and them. There's some great stuff I want to talk about with like the idea of passports and like what it means to be a citizen, cultural education, and how history is used. Like citizenship means you have studied that country's history. Just as you teach historical education, when you teach history, you teach people how to see that world from your perspective, right? And the only way to become a citizen is to learn another country's history. That is as simple as that. That is what naturalization is, citizenship tests. Absorbing their culture, absorbing that history, absorbing the knowledge of that country makes you a citizen. A citizen is not just born, it is molded and formed through their education system, their history classes, their shared experiences, their shared struggles, and that's the idea of naturalization between military and even school age, right? The natural right given by birth. Um, a lot of interesting stuff there with the equality and theory of man, but we're going to go into the very basic ideas of French Revolution, which is liberty, equality, fraternity, equality, fraternity, right? And so we see this through the lens of a French Revolution, where we see the unhappy. There's no other way to put it, but as I said, I want to avoid the negative connotations, try to depict this in the positive light before people start to tear this apart. But just the peasants or the farm workers being oppressed to the point where they can no longer survive. If you look at a lot of Chinese web novels, they talk about how the emperor doesn't see people as people, but rather as property. These are just lives to be lost, right? There's a very interesting web novel quote, if I could pull that up, that said, a child talks to his father and he said, "What do we call these people, these dead bodies on the battlefield? Who were they? Are they our enemies? Were they our friends? What do we do with them? And like, what do we call them?" And his father, the emperor of the land, just said, "They are the same as everyone. They are just now pieces of history because they're all dead. So what does it matter, right? Victor's law. It's like they're just pieces of sand in time." I want to get into the idea of knowledge in a little bit, so I'm going to be throwing into my own insights. But we see most Verac slowly seeing the challenges of this era. And we also see what most Verac becomes and what he contributes. So at the end of Volume 1, he gains his identity as Thomas Chris. And just as simply, he is absorbed into this whirlpool of this aristocratic faction. And here's where the disclaimers begin. He is betrayed by a friend. I won't say who, I won't say in what circumstances, but it changes the way he looks at things. Our main character is suddenly thrust into this era of rapid change. Just as the world is quickly changing around him and he's being changed by the world, he is also changing the world and this he's changing the world in and of itself. And later on, Most Vrak becomes a very unique character. Right now, he is just Thomas Chris, this noble son that committed a very major crime, the crime of revolution and rebellion against the king, against the government, because they dared to fight for something that no one else dared to. This is the era where death is cheap. People's lives are cheap, they're worth nothing, right? Literally, um, people die every single day. So, a human life back then was very fragile. Like, right? Most people didn't live past the age of 16. That's why the age of an adult was so young, because most people weren't expected to live that long. Yes, people lived to the age of 80 if they were healthy. The luxurious had long lives, but the average age was pretty low due to child mortality, right? All these ideas, a lot of interesting things happened post Renaissance and Romance, right? The love of Roman culture, right, which then translated into love of others, right? Philo meaning love, philosophy meaning the love of knowledge, Philadelphia meaning the love, a city of brotherly love. Delphi, I assume, means man. Philo or Phil meaning love of, philic, right? So that's the Latin root. Um, but we see this change in the times. He is thrust into this crazy society, almost a cult, he seems. It's almost a religion, a political society. And this is so reminiscent of an espionage web novel where we transition from one scene to a very different background. I want to talk about the Red Scarf Society a lot, but I don't want to get too much into it. But he joins this underground society, right? If you were to romanticize it, you would call them the resistance group, right? Just like how the resistance group existed in World War II Germany, these are also, resistance can also be considered, domestic terrorists. They act very similarly, whether it's domestic terrorist cells or, resistance groups fighting like a fascist force. I want to be very blunt here. I want to be very neutral in saying that they all act the same. It's more just what people are considered right, who is right and who is wrong, whether you're the resistance or the force and power, right? So I'm going to take this from a strategy stuff standpoint. These are just the guerrilla forces, right? Like the Revolutionary Army versus the British Army, or the French Revolution versus the monarchy or the Parliament, right? Where we saw Robespierre's government fall and fall back to the monarchy, which is Louis the 16th, I believe, and then we go back to Napoleon, which is the parliamentary uh, first second republic, I believe. Louis the Sun King, 14th to 16th, I think was fell. We saw the same thing in the English Civil War, Agincourt, I think 20 years war, 100 years war before that. War of Roses a little bit later, but the English Civil War, we saw Charles the First take over Scotland. What was Civil War? Scott, no, 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 not the Monroe Doctrine. What did Charles the First, Charles First, um, King of England, not Spain, that's Philip. Absolute monarch, constitute monarchy. What did he sign? Magna Carta. Yeah. So Declaration of Rights and Man. We saw a lot of great ideas, thinkers, and Enlightenment, Voltaire. Um, but Most Vrak is in this changing political climate of revolution where he stumbles upon these works of workers' protests and workers' rights. This era of what I would declare like the 1920s, where the unions were actually still very popular fighting for workers' rights, where working hours were limited, right, to 40-hour work. I think it was still 60-hour work weeks, right? Sunday off for religious purposes, but then they reduced it to 40-hour work weeks. Child labor, right? Child labor was a big right, right? Fire escapes. None of those existed. Women's suffrage wouldn't come until 50 years later. You had Bleeding Kansas, which is the idea of slavery. All these things are happening in very quick succession, and all of these cannot be contained in one web novel. We talk about immigration and xenophobia, but there's only so much you can do. We have Central American immigrants. Central America is and South America is very much lumped in with Asia in the country of Mongolia. You have Bash, which is representative or a parallel to Russia. You have Wellerman, which is a parallel to England, right? Wellerman is the sea shanty because naval. Castilia, which is a reference to Spain. And Prumen, which is a Hulu, Hulu, which is a reference to Prussia, right? Because you go from Holy Roman Empire to the lot of mini states to Super Germany, as we would say in White 4. And then Italy, Lombard had their own thing. The Pope to Mussolini. Mussolini talked about film. But in this fantasy world, there's a lot of interesting things happen. So most Vrack in his identity as Thomas Chris meets a whole host of people. He meets this rich dandy. Honestly, as you read a lot more Chable novels, you realize how much it is not the spoiled rich kids that are bad. It is the malicious spoiled rich kids that actively want to do harm that are bad. Because I think I recently came across a web novel, like to put yourselves in their shoes. It's like if you were a rich kid, like you wouldn't want much out of life because everything's given to you, right? Like some would say that's a sad life, which is true because you'll always live a life unfulfilled. But at the same time, it's like why work hard when everything comes to you, right? So it's like if you can have a kind nature and be spoiled, I think that's fine because at least you bring good out in the world. But if you're actively malicious, like you can do a lot of damage. Okay, like so the two worst guys are actively malicious and ambitious and malicious, right? Like people who actively cover up crimes. I think society cannot stand for. If you cause trouble, you're like a troublemaker, but you don't break the limits of the law and you don't actively harm people. My standards are quite low on that. Like then I'm like, you know what? Live and let live, man. I mean like as long as there's upward mobility and there's a chance for people to go for it, this is kind of rich coming from me, but I don't want to talk about it. Like, yeah, it's not for my place to judge. I don't like judging people. But we meet this rich dandy who has no idea the struggles that his friends are going through because he's living a nice life, he's not harming anyone, he's relatively good natured, like by all remarks he stands by his friends, right? It's like everyone's like he's so immature he can't handle it, so it's like what, like but he's loyal, he's kind, he has all those attributes if not a little bit ignorant, but like who isn't at that age? Well, okay, to be honest, they're all adults, so, but I kind of see them as children just because it's a web novel and parasocialism and whatnot. But Colin is comes from a very wealthy family with dreams, right? He's well educated and he has no purpose in life, to be honest with you. He's kind of like just coasting through life, but that's not a like for him that's like decent thing, right? He's going to be trained to be a government, but he gives most Vrack the most powerful piece of knowledge. He is most Vrack's only friend. Thomas Chris didn't have a lot of friends, but he was most Vrack's only wealthy friend. Most Vrack does not exist. He's still Thomas Chris, but I will always refer to him as most Vrack in my heart. But even then, right, like they all okay, it's very unfair to most Frack because he's thrust into this identity he never asked for, but also because he has that identity, he gets advantages that no one has given him. So there's a little bit of a give and take there in that dilemma of the main character being that body double, but all of this is very self-explanatory and all self-contained. But most Vrack lives this false life, this false lie as Thomas Chris, and he either dies with that identity or he somehow escapes this trap, this rich life, right? Because he's a poor guy and he wants to, retire in some wealth, and then he's faced with all these moral dilemmas, right? These mysteries of who was Thomas Chris and what was the mystery of why did he eventually die? His father uh, Carmine Thomas runs a gramophone company, which is very reminiscent to the Edison company. And I kept thinking of Edison, Westinghouse, and Tesla, right? The great current wars, and the monopolies and all that. Carmen's actively hostile, very much your classic. He's one of the first major villains in the story, and then he gets downgraded to a minor villain. But he's just an interesting background character. There's so many arcs. I haven't even gotten through Volume 1 yet. Volume 2, like there is so many dense arcs. I like the amount of characters you will meet: Boyan, Thomas, Chris, Francis, and the Worker Strikes. You all of these details. I can go on for hours, right? We meet Robert Keating in like volume 3. I'm not even there yet. So we have like the post volume 1 arc, which means his identity is revealed and he becomes his identity is half revealed. It's still a secret, and that secret doesn't get detonated till volume 5. So there's a lot of foreshadowing. A lot of the class consciousness that's like put on so far on the back burner. By the time they even bring it up, it's not even a really big plot point. It's just like it's just there. And honestly, I don't have a problem with it because most of this is framed in the idea of the French Revolution rather than that stuff's like chapter 425 out of 523. So it's like we'll deal with those issues when we get there, but it's like there's too many chapters to talk about that's not even like a major detail. That's like the smallest of small things. um the change, the character development most Vrak goes in, the timeline is very accelerated. A lot of things happen in 4 years, so from 1433 to 1460. Most Vrak in his 3 months of living does more than what most would do in their 20 months of life, right? We all say that, the first 20 years you feel like you do nothing. And then the next 20, oh my gosh, there's a lot in life will throw at you. You were suddenly thrust into the adult world and there is just a lot to deal with. But most Vrak is at that seminal, that critical period of learning what that world is, and he's just thrust into this world of adventure, the world that he may not have asked for, but that is a path in life that he has taken, he has given, and he is going to deal with. Those are the cards he has dealt with. Every single danger you think is a danger is an opportunity, and through this most Vrak, his character development is so unique. The struggles that he deal with, the problems that he faces, the griefs, the insurmountable forces against him. There's so many moments where okay, if it was any other web novel, you would be assured that the main character survives. There is no plot armor. The author holds no punches. At any moment, the main character can die. So we're going from a meta perspective. I keep getting absorbed into this web novel because this story does not care whether a main character lives or not. He could very well die in the first volume, and there are plenty of other stories to explore. Right, Ergen, Jingyong, famous web novel writers, will kill off main characters. Like more main characters die here than I think Shakespeare or George R. Martin is, right? I commented, Red Wedding, that's more like a red puddle. Hongmen Feast, um, that's more like red gelatin, right? This story goes through main characters and recycles them and spits them out, and it traumatizes main characters. Main characters will die. Supporting cast will die. No one is exempt from death. The question is when. It is just one of those very depressing and complicated and nuanced and challenging web novels. And because like there's so many twists and turns and surprises you just do not expect, that like even if you were to expect it, like this author has thrown tropes I have never seen before. I have never read in a web novel before it, and I have not read in a web novel since. Even in all the books I've read, I have never seen anything like it. Not in Blackstone's Code, not in Joy of Life. There was another web novel that I wanted to bring up. Um, not in Joy of Life, not in Kingdom's Bloodline with Thales, not in Light Barrier, not in Nomenclature of the Night, um, Black Agent. Oh, so it is called Black Agent. Yeah, so I did a podcast episode on that. But it's just a magical industrial empire, Sword of Daybreak, like a lot of those industry web novels. Like this is unique in and of itself. As I said, I bring this out from my hidden gems and hidden treasures because I read this in 2021, and like rereading it again, I am still just as lost. I will never read a web novel. I never want to make a review of a web novel I've never fully read. And I will only recommend it if I feel like it's fully popular. I once wanted to, one of my first web novel reviews was going to be Godfather Champions and The Winner is King. I just wasn't good enough at creating videos at the time. God, good grief. Do you know how many chapters the Winter of King is? The Winter is King. I think that's like 1,600 chapters. I went through every single chapter, read every single word, and just pulled words and documents. And that 1,600 chapters was still easier to read than this 500 chapter um 27 years. Like I can talk to you about the author of this web novel. He didn't care much for the title. He just wanted to make it simple. And honestly, like you will understand what that means. You'll think of like the Beatles, 60 years old, or like 7 Years by Lucas Graham. I think those are great BGM music. I mean, he talks about like some of the author support, which is Pan Long. That's a very famous author in the Chidia Web Novel Alliance. But 27 years, like the cast of characters, the background settings from, like there's so many things left unexplored. The character interactions are so deep. Like a lot of the ways the mysteries are even solved is very much like deductive reasoning in Sherlock Holmes, where you are just exposed to the story. There is no background. There is no there is no gimmicks to be had. There are no rules to be followed. It is just life and death. This feels like an apocalyptic web novel where things just happen and you are just those are the story. There is no level up. There is no Wuxi world. There's no success. There's only forward or back, right? As I said, there is no plot armor because you have no idea where this is going to go. You have a rough idea, like plot lines are set out in advance, but these arcs close and just something completely new will happen. And because it's only 500 chapters, it never gets old. Nomenclature gets old because you get used to the routine. And you get to the routine of, oh, a new event happens, main character goes to solve it. This is new event happens, you kind of see it happening, and then something you cannot expect happens, and but it's all building up to something, right? Just like when there's a big mystery, it's like, oh, there's this evil villain that has to be solved, right? In a web novel, like that evil mystery, or it's, oh, there's this existential threat coming and we have to solve this, and you have to constantly level up in a wuxi or xinxia world. This is a very self-contained web novel. The ending is just as unexpected and unique as the rest. It will pull no punches. I will guarantee you that. The ending may will only make sense once you volume 5 in. Like if you miss one volume, you will not understand why volume 5 ends the way it does. You will not understand anything. Like you can read volumes 1 through 4. I did that. I didn't read volume 5. I read the ending. I still did not understand why it was. I just knew that it was great because the writing is solid. This is as I said, this is a unique web novel. I want to say amazing, but that doesn't give enough credit. It is a challenging web novel. It is so freaking dense. Like in 500 chapters, it does what web novels it does in 500 chapters what web novels with 3,000 chapters struggle to do. Power and Wealth, right? That was 2,600 chapters, right? I read a lot of urban life. I read a lot of entertainment, right? There are some great ones out there. Directors of the music department, full-time artists, disaster artists. I only make bad movies, right? Magical Industrial Empire goes to 1,600, right? If I were to talk about Kingdom, I'm kind of sad I lament I didn't get to talk about Goblin Kingdom, Lord of Empire, right? World Online, those are some great ones. Apocalypse Online, right? A lot of those Empire ones, Goblin Kingdom was so influential, right? No Game, No Life, um, in the empire building genre. But this was special. Um, and yeah, it talks a lot about knowledge, right? Like I think it was so interesting to see how it talked about like political philosophy has to be built, right? Like, once that framework is built, you still have to test, right? Test the scientific hypothesis. Even political theories have to be tested. Otherwise, there's no point in using it, right? Like a lot of the conclusions we came to is because of social problems. That social contract exists because there were problems in society and political frameworks had to be filled in to solve it. So political science is there's a reason why political science exists. Everyone calls it a joke. Well, I don't think everyone calls it a joke, but like, I think people mock it, but there's a reason why it's studied because it is difficult. The relationship between people, the relationship between power, what even politics means. Politics is the balance of interests between various groups of people, right? Where there's people, there's politics. You cannot avoid it, just like in chemistry and in so many other fields of science and math and writing. Everything is essential. And, you know, yeah, it's a great story. So 27 years, 27年在, by Ronke. 532 chapters, but these 532 chapters, I'd say maybe a 2-month read, 24 hours, so maybe an hour a day. take it at your own pace. Take it slow. Enjoy it, because I guarantee you, once you start reading it, if you fall in love with this challenging web novel, you will binge it, because this is just one of those stories you binge. You pick it up, and it is very hard to put down. It is dense. It is packed. You better be focused. Like, oh my gosh, like a lot of Wuxi web novels are just, or web novels are supposed to be easy to pick up and put down because they're just fun. This is challenging. And if you want that sense of fulfillment, then if you want a web novel that is a novel, this is it. I'm not going to do too many of these because these are kind of special, and I don't have a lot of these in the chamber, like Sword of Daybreak or World of Deities. I go into my opinions on those, but like again, they're called hidden gems for a reason because I don't have a lot of them. Okay, and I may have read a lot of web novels, but I have to finish, number one, I have to finish a web novel, and two, I actually have to find and read and screen these. So every single one of these hidden gems um, are special to me, and 27 is one of the most special ones I've ever read compared to Nuclear Dragon, Blackstone Code. Those were special, right? Light Barrier, right? Apocalypse Code. Um, like Apocalypse Merchant. I could go on and on about titles, but these to me are not just regular titles. These are like cream of the crop, like 448. So many web novel titles I can do, but I have neither the energy nor time to cover all of them, for fully give um the proper time. And I don't even think I did this web novel that well. I split it into two parts with volumes. But enough about the meta talk and um high level stuff. That's 27 Years by Ronke. That's all I have to say, and we'll stop here.